The gunshot echoed across the Colorado plains like thunder splitting open the summer sky. Abigail Anderson stood in the doorway of the tobacco barn, her hands still trembling around the pistol that had just ended overseer Samuel Thompson's reign of terror. Blood pooled beneath his body while the setting sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Plantation, turning everything the color of old rust. This is the story of how one woman's desperate act of self-defense transformed her from property into the most hunted fugitive in Colorado territory, not just for her, but for everyone who believed enslaved people would accept brutality without resistance. What you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over 170 years, a tale of survival, calculated revenge, and a mother's fierce determination to protect what remained of her humanity when the law offered her none. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Willow Creek Plantation stretched across 200 acres of Colorado Territory bottomland in the summer of 1852, where dust devils danced across tobacco fields and the Rocky Mountains rose like sentinels in the western distance. Master Jonathan Caldwell ruled his domain with the methodical cruelty of a man who'd built his fortune on the backs of human beings he considered livestock. His operation was smaller than the massive southern plantations, but no less brutal in its efficiency. His wife Virginia managed the household with iron-fisted practicality, viewing enslaved people as investments requiring maintenance but not mercy. Together they presided over 89 enslaved souls, including Abigail Anderson, 28 years old, field supervisor, and according to the plantation ledger, worth exactly $1.100 due to her literacy and management skills. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of Western expansion, I want to know, what time is it where you are right now? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between your safety and someone else's power? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories of resistance against impossible odds fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear involves a woman who refused to accept that her body was someone else's property, and the price she paid for that refusal has echoed through Colorado history for over a century and a half. Abigail had arrived at Willow Creek 5 years earlier, purchased from a failed mining operation in Nevada Territory where her previous owner had gone bankrupt during the gold rush collapse. The bill of sale listed her special skills separately from standard field labor: reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and most valuable to Caldwell, the ability to manage other workers without constant white supervision. The purchase price of $1.100 reflected these rare capabilities. Most field hands sold for $600 to $800, but Abigail's education made her worth nearly double. Her previous owner had taught her to read so she could maintain mining records, never imagining that literacy would become both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. Caldwell had acquired Abigail specifically to oversee tobacco processing, a complex operation requiring careful timing and quality control. She managed rotating crews of 20 workers, ensuring leaves were harvested at peak ripeness, properly cured in the drying barns, and prepared for shipment to eastern markets, where Colorado tobacco commanded premium prices. The work was brutal, but Abigail had earned a measure of respect from both enslaved workers and white overseers through her competence. She occupied an unusual position in Willow Creek's hierarchy, too valuable to waste on simple field labor, too black to ever be considered truly human by the whites who profited from her skills. Samuel Thompson had arrived at Willow Creek 3 months before the shooting, hired by Caldwell to increase productivity during the critical summer harvest season. He came with references from plantations in Missouri, where he'd built a reputation for extracting maximum labor through a combination of psychological manipulation and strategic violence. Thompson was 34 years old, lean and weathered, with eyes that calculated human worth in pounds of tobacco and measures of fear. He learned his trade on the brutal hemp plantations along the Missouri River, where enslaved people were worked to death and replaced as casually as broken tools. From Jonathan Caldwell's personal correspondence, June 1852, Thompson comes highly recommended for his ability to manage difficult laborers. His methods may seem harsh to Eastern sensibilities, but frontier agriculture demands results over sentiment. Production has increased 23% since his arrival. Thompson's methods included public whippings for minor infractions, withholding food rations to enforce compliance, and separating families as punishment for resistance. But his particular specialty involved identifying enslaved people with status or skills, then systematically breaking them to demonstrate that no one stood above his authority. Abigail became his primary target within a week of his arrival. She'd made the mistake of correcting him during a tobacco processing session, politely pointing out that his instructions would ruin an entire batch of premium leaves. Thompson had smiled, thanked her for the information, then ordered her whipped that evening for insubordination and disrespect toward white authority. The whipping was measured, 10 lashes, enough to humiliate, but not enough to damage Caldwell's valuable investment. Thompson understood the economics of slavery perfectly. You could hurt enslaved people, but destroying their ability to work destroyed their owner's wealth. What followed was a campaign of psychological warfare that revealed Thompson's true expertise. He didn't need to physically destroy Abigail. He needed to break her spirit while maintaining her productivity. The methods he employed were calculated to isolate her from allies, undermine her authority with other workers, and create constant fear without providing grounds for her to complain to Caldwell. He reassigned her crews randomly, preventing her from building working relationships. He questioned her decisions publicly, forcing her to justify choices she'd made successfully for 5 years. He created impossible standards, then punished her for failures he'd engineered. But the real horror began when Thompson started visiting the women's quarters after dark. The cabin Abigail shared with 7 other women stood at the eastern edge of the enslaved community, a rough structure of timber and clay that offered minimal protection from Colorado's temperature extremes. Summer nights brought relief from daytime heat, but no relief from the sound of Thompson's boots on the dirt path outside. He would stand in the doorway, lantern in hand, surveying the women like a buyer examining livestock. Sometimes he'd choose someone and leave. Sometimes he'd simply watch for long minutes, letting the threat of selection hang in the air like smoke. Abigail had survived this pattern before on the Nevada mining operation. She knew the signs, understood the escalation, recognized that Thompson was building toward something specific. Every night that passed without him choosing her increased the probability that the next night would be different. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late July, when the tobacco barns were full of curing leaves and the harvest season approached its peak intensity. Thompson had been pushing everyone harder, demanding longer hours and higher quality while reducing food rations to improve efficiency. Abigail had worked a 14-hour shift supervising the delicate process of hanging tobacco leaves in precise arrangements that allowed proper air circulation. Her hands were stained dark brown from handling the sticky leaves, her back ached from constant bending, and exhaustion had settled into her bones like an old injury. She'd returned to the quarters after dark, hoping for a few hours of sleep before the next day's brutal schedule began, but Thompson was already there, sitting on the steps of the women's cabin, cleaning his rifle with deliberate slowness. "Abigail," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone she'd learned to fear, "walk with me to the tobacco barn. There's a matter of quality control we need to discuss." The other women in the cabin went completely still. Everyone understood what quality control meant when discussed in private after dark. One of the older women, Hannah, caught Abigail's eye with a look that conveyed both sympathy and helplessness. No one would intervene. Intervention meant becoming a target yourself, and survival in bondage required calculating which battles could be fought and which could only be endured. Abigail made a choice in that moment that would transform her from valuable property into hunted fugitive. Instead of following Thompson toward the isolated tobacco barn, she turned and walked toward the main house where Caldwell kept his office. "I'll need to finish tomorrow's work assignments first," she said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding through her veins. "Master Caldwell expects the processing schedule by morning." It was a calculated gamble, invoking Caldwell's economic interests against Thompson's predatory intentions. Thompson couldn't openly admit he planned to assault Caldwell's valuable investment when she had legitimate work justifications. Thompson's expression went cold with the particular rage of a man whose authority had been challenged by someone he considered beneath human status. He stood slowly, setting his rifle aside with careful precision. "The processing schedule can wait," he said quietly. "Walk to the tobacco barn now, or I'll drag you there and add insubordination to your list of offenses." This was the moment Abigail would replay 1,000 times in the weeks to come, analyzing every decision, every word, every possible alternative to the path she chose. But in that moment, standing in the Colorado darkness with Thompson's threat hanging in the air and her dignity hanging by a thread, she made the only choice that felt like survival. She ran toward the main house, hoping that proximity to white authority might provide protection that the law never would. Thompson caught her before she'd covered 20 yards, his hand closing around her arm with bruising force. What happened next in the struggle that followed, in the desperate scramble that led them both toward the tobacco barn where Caldwell kept his loaded pistol for protection against coyotes and thieves, would become the subject of legal debate, moral judgment, and historical controversy for generations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But one fact remained undisputed. When the sun rose over Willow Creek Plantation the next morning, Samuel Thompson lay dead with a bullet through his chest, and Abigail Anderson had vanished into the Colorado wilderness with blood on her hands and freedom burning in her heart like a promise that might cost everything to keep. Abigail's journey to that fatal night began not in Colorado, but in the chaotic final days of the California gold rush, when fortunes collapsed as quickly as they'd been made and human lives became currency in desperate men's gambling debts. She'd been born into slavery in 1824 on a tobacco plantation in Kentucky, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Sarah and a white overseer whose name was never recorded in any ledger or family Bible. Her mixed heritage showed in features that white people found uncomfortably ambiguous, neither fully black nor white enough to ignore the obvious circumstances of her conception. Her mother Sarah possessed a rare gift, the ability to read, taught secretly by a plantation owner's daughter who'd believed education could somehow soften the brutality of bondage. Sarah passed this dangerous knowledge to Abigail during stolen moments after fieldwork, scratching letters in dirt and teaching words by candlelight in their cabin. By age 12, Abigail could read better than most white people in rural Kentucky. By age 15, she could write well enough to forge passes and transport documents. By age 18, her literacy made her valuable enough to be sold separately from her mother when their owner died and the estate was liquidated. The separation happened on a spring morning in 1842. Abigail remembered standing on an auction block in Louisville while white men examined her teeth, tested her limbs, and asked her to demonstrate her reading by reciting from a newspaper. Her mother watched from a holding pen, chains around her wrists, unable to even touch her daughter one final time. The mining entrepreneur who purchased Abigail for $800 needed someone to maintain records at his Nevada Territory silver operation. He was 52 years old, calculating rather than cruel, viewing enslaved people as investments requiring proper maintenance to protect their value. For 6 years, Abigail managed the mining camp's books, tracking ore weights, worker assignments, supply inventories, and payment records. The work was cleaner than field labor, but no less enslaved. She lived in a small cabin near the main office, isolated from other enslaved workers, neither fully part of the mining camp's white society nor its black laboring community. The arrangement ended abruptly in 1848 when silver deposits ran dry and the mining operation collapsed. Her owner, facing bankruptcy and creditor seizures, sold everything of value, including the human beings he'd claimed as property. Abigail found herself once again on an auction block, once again being examined like livestock, once again watching her life's direction determined by whoever bid highest. Jonathan Caldwell purchased her for $100 in a Virginia City auction, recognizing immediately that her literacy and management experience could solve a problem plaguing his Colorado tobacco operation. He needed someone to supervise the complex curing process, someone who could read processing manuals and maintain quality records. But he refused to hire white overseers who might demand actual wages and respect. An enslaved woman with Abigail's skills offered the perfect solution, competent management without the inconvenience of treating her as fully human. The bill of sale from September 1847 listed her assets with clinical precision. Female Negro, age 23, literate, experienced in records management and labor supervision, healthy constitution, proven capacity for complex tasks, valued at $100 including transport costs to Colorado Territory. From Virginia Caldwell's Household Diary, October 1847. Jonathan's new purchase arrived today, a mulatto woman with uncommon education for her kind. She seems intelligent but properly submissive. I trust she understands her position here is one of privilege compared to field laborers, and will not develop pretensions above her station. Abigail's 5 years at Willow Creek before Thompson's arrival had been characterized by careful navigation of impossible contradictions. She held authority over other enslaved people, but possessed no actual power. She made decisions affecting plantation profitability but owned nothing, not even her own body or future. She'd learned to make herself valuable enough to protect against casual sale or violence, but not so valuable that she threatened white authority. She supervised workers without developing relationships that might lead to collective resistance. She demonstrated competence while performing subservience, showing intelligence while never questioning the system that enslaved her. The tobacco operation required genuine expertise. Colorado's high altitude and dry climate produced tobacco with unique characteristics that Eastern markets valued highly, but the curing process demanded precision. Too much humidity ruined leaves with mold. Too little turned them brittle and worthless. Temperature fluctuations during the 6-week curing period could destroy entire harvests. Abigail had mastered these variables through 5 growing seasons, developing an intuitive understanding of how Colorado's mountain weather affected tobacco processing. She could predict rain by changes in leaf moisture content, adjust barn ventilation based on subtle temperature shifts, and identify premium leaves by texture and color variations invisible to less experienced observers. This expertise made her indispensable to Caldwell's operation, which generated roughly $18,000 annually in tobacco sales. Abigail's management ensured consistent quality that commanded premium prices, directly contributing to profits that Caldwell used to expand his land holdings and purchase additional enslaved workers. But expertise offered no protection against men like Samuel Thompson, whose power derived not from competence but from willingness to use violence in service of white supremacy. Thompson had arrived in late April 1852, hired specifically to increase production during what Caldwell anticipated would be a record harvest season. Eastern demand for Colorado tobacco was surging, and Caldwell wanted to maximize profits before market conditions changed. From Samuel Thompson's employment contract, April 1852, compensation set at $65 monthly plus housing and provisions, with bonus payments of 5% of production increases above previous year's yields. Authority granted to manage enslaved laborers through any means necessary to achieve production targets, provided valuable property is not permanently damaged. That final clause, provided valuable property is not permanently damaged, established the only limit on Thompson's authority. He could hurt enslaved people in any way that didn't reduce their economic value. Everything else was permitted, even encouraged, as long as tobacco production increased. Thompson understood this framework perfectly. He'd spent 15 years on Missouri plantations learning how to extract maximum labor through calculated applications of pain, fear, and psychological manipulation. He knew exactly how hard you could whip someone before they couldn't work the next day. He knew which punishments terrorized without destroying productivity. He knew how to identify the strongest personalities in any enslaved community and break them publicly to demoralize everyone else. Abigail represented everything Thompson most enjoyed destroying: competence, dignity, and the dangerous illusion that enslaved people could earn respect through excellence. Within days of his arrival, he'd identified her as the person whose public humiliation would send the strongest message to Willow Creek's enslaved community. The campaign began subtly: questions about her decisions, delivered in front of other workers, suggestions that perhaps her authority had made her forget her proper place, comments about how educated slaves often developed dangerous ideas about their own worth. Then came the reassignments, the impossible standards, the engineered failures that justified punishments. Thompson was building a case for breaking Abigail's spirit, while maintaining the documentation that would justify his actions to Caldwell as necessary discipline rather than sadistic cruelty. But Thompson made one critical miscalculation. He assumed Abigail's 5 years of careful submission meant she'd accept anything to preserve her relatively privileged position. He didn't understand that submission born of strategic survival could transform into resistance when survival itself was threatened. The night he demanded she accompany him to the tobacco barn, Thompson thought he was exercising the same authority he'd wielded over countless enslaved women across Missouri and Colorado. He didn't recognize that he was pushing someone who'd already calculated that death might be preferable to certain forms of survival. The 3 months leading to that fatal July night followed a pattern Abigail recognized from previous plantations, but Thompson's execution was more sophisticated than anything she'd experienced before. He didn't rely solely on physical violence. he weaponized the entire plantation's social structure against her. May brought the first serious escalation. Thompson publicly questioned Abigail's tobacco grading during a processing session, claiming she'd misidentified premium leaves and cost Caldwell potential revenue. The accusation was completely false, but Thompson had prepared documentation that appeared to support his claims. Caldwell, trusting his overseer's judgment over his enslaved supervisor's expertise, docked Abigail's already minimal food rations as punishment for the alleged error. The penalty wasn't about the tobacco. It was about establishing that Thompson's word would always prevail over Abigail's competence. From Jonathan Caldwell's plantation log, May 1852, Thompson reports quality control issues in tobacco processing. Have addressed the situation with appropriate corrective measures. Cannot allow slaves, regardless of their skills, to believe they operate beyond accountability. The message rippled through Willow Creek's enslaved community. If someone as valuable and careful as Abigail could be punished based on false accusations, no one was safe. Thompson had successfully demonstrated that competence offered no protection, that excellence couldn't shield anyone from his authority. June brought psychological warfare. Thompson began arriving at processing sessions without warning, disrupting Abigail's carefully planned workflows, then blaming her when efficiency declined. He reassigned her most experienced workers to other tasks, replacing them with new people unfamiliar with tobacco processing, then criticized the inevitable reduction in quality. Each engineered failure justified additional punishments, building a documented record of incompetence that directly contradicted Abigail's 5 years of excellent performance. Thompson was constructing a narrative that would eventually justify either selling her away from Willow Creek or breaking her completely through escalating discipline. But the real terror came after dark, when Thompson's visits to the women's quarters became routine enough to establish a pattern, but unpredictable enough to maintain constant anxiety. Some nights he'd choose a woman and disappear toward the tobacco barns or storage sheds. Other nights he'd simply watch, letting fear do the work that violence might accomplish less efficiently. The other enslaved women began avoiding Abigail, understanding that association with Thompson's primary target could make them targets themselves. Hannah, the older woman who'd offered that sympathetic look, stopped sitting near Abigail during the brief rest periods. The younger women who'd once asked her advice about processing techniques now worked in silence, avoiding eye contact. Thompson had successfully isolated Abigail from every potential source of support or solidarity. She worked alone, ate alone, and spent evenings in a cabin where 7 other women treated her like a dangerous object that might attract lightning if touched. The loneliness was perhaps more devastating than the physical punishments. Abigail had survived bondage by forming careful connections with other enslaved people, creating networks of mutual support that helped everyone endure the unendurable. Now those networks dissolved under pressure of Thompson's systematic campaign to make her untouchable. Early July brought the final escalation. Thompson began making explicit comments about Abigail's appearance, observations delivered publicly, but phrased as casual conversation rather than direct harassment. He'd mention her features in ways that made clear he viewed her body as something he could claim whenever he chose. "That one's got interesting bloodlines," he told another overseer within Abigail's hearing, probably worth keeping around for reasons beyond tobacco processing. The other enslaved workers heard these comments and understood their implication. Thompson was announcing his intentions, letting everyone know what was coming, so that when it finally happened, no one would be surprised enough to resist or report it. From Hannah's testimony, given years later to a frontier newspaper, "We all knew what was building. Mr. Thompson made it clear as daylight what he intended, but what could we do? Speaking up meant getting sold away or worse. We had families, people depending on us. I'm not proud of our silence, but survival makes cowards of us all." The confrontation that ended with Thompson's death began with something seemingly trivial, a dispute about barn ventilation during a particularly humid evening when weather conditions threatened an entire batch of premium tobacco leaves. Abigail had been adjusting ventilation slats in the main curing barn, using knowledge gained through 5 years of experience with Colorado's unpredictable mountain weather. The humidity spike required increased air circulation to prevent mold, but too much ventilation would dry the leaves too quickly and ruin their texture. Thompson appeared in the barn doorway just after sunset, his presence immediately transforming the space from workspace into trap, The other workers quietly left, understanding that remaining meant witnessing something they'd be forced to stay silent about later. "Close those vents," Thompson ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You're letting too much air through." Abigail kept adjusting the slats, her hands steady despite growing dread. "The humidity's too high. If we don't increase circulation, we'll lose the entire batch to mold by morning." I said close them. Thompson stepped fully into the barn, letting the door swing shut behind him. The sound of wood against frame felt final, like a coffin lid closing. This was the moment when years of careful submission collided with the fundamental human need for dignity and bodily autonomy. Abigail could surrender her judgment about tobacco processing and probably survive Thompson's immediate intentions. She could accept that her expertise meant nothing compared to his authority. But she knew with absolute certainty that ventilation wasn't the real issue. Thompson had manufactured this confrontation as pretext for exactly the kind of isolated encounter he'd been building toward for 3 months. "The tobacco will be ruined," Abigail said quietly, still focused on the ventilation slats rather than looking directly at Thompson. "Master Caldwell will lose over $3,000 in premium leaves." Thompson laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Caldwell will believe whatever I tell him. Just like he believed you've been making mistakes. Just like he'll believe you came to this barn willingly when I'm done with you." The threat was explicit now, stripped of pretense or ambiguity. Thompson had engineered complete isolation, manufactured documentation of Abigail's supposed incompetence, and positioned himself to claim any encounter was consensual or at least justified as discipline for her ongoing failures. What happened next would be disputed in legal proceedings, debated in newspaper accounts, and argued over by historians for decades, but certain facts remained undisputed. Thompson moved toward Abigail with clear predatory intent. Abigail backed away toward the corner where Caldwell kept supplies, including a loaded pistol for protection against predatory animals and potential thieves. A physical struggle ensued as Thompson attempted to restrain Abigail, and Abigail fought with the desperate strength of someone who'd already decided that death was preferable to what Thompson intended. The pistol was in Caldwell's supply cabinet, supposedly locked but left carelessly unsecured after an earlier inventory check. Abigail reached it before Thompson could fully restrain her. In the struggle that followed, as Thompson attempted to take the weapon from her hands, the pistol discharged with a sound that echoed across the entire plantation like judgment finally arriving for crimes too long ignored. Samuel Thompson fell backward, his expression showing more surprise than pain in the first moments after the bullet entered his chest. He stared at Abigail with something like incomprehension, as though the very concept of an enslaved woman defending herself violated fundamental laws of nature. He tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth instead of words. He reached toward Abigail one final time, whether in attack or plea impossible to determine. Then his hand fell, his breathing stopped, and Samuel Thompson became just another body in a barn that smelled of tobacco, gunpowder, and the particular copper scent of blood soaking into wooden floorboards. Abigail stood over him, the pistol still trembling in her grip, her mind racing through calculations that would determine whether she lived as a fugitive or died as an example to every other enslaved person who might dare to resist white authority. The sun had set completely now, darkness filling the barn except for lamplight filtering through gaps in the walls. Outside, the plantation continued its evening routines, people finishing final tasks before heading to quarters, completely unaware that everything had just changed. Abigail had perhaps 10 minutes before someone came looking for Thompson, maybe less. Those 10 minutes would determine whether she spent her remaining life running toward freedom or swinging from a rope as entertainment for white people who believed her death would reinforce the natural order of racial hierarchy. She made her choice in the seconds it took Thompson's blood to reach her feet, soaking into the same floorboards where tobacco sap had been leaving stains for 5 years. The choice wasn't between right and wrong, legal and illegal, or even life and death. It was between accepting that she was property without rights, dignity, or humanity, or claiming freedom regardless of the price that claiming would demand. The first thing Abigail did after Thompson fell was extinguish the lamp. Darkness flooded the tobacco barn, transforming the familiar space into something alien and dangerous. She could hear her own breathing, rapid and shallow, competing with the sound of blood dripping from Thompson's body onto the wooden floor below. Her hands moved with mechanical precision born from years of managing crisis situations where a single mistake could mean punishment or death. She couldn't afford panic now. The gunshot would have been heard across portions of the plantation, but Colorado's evening winds and the distance between buildings might have distorted the sound enough that people couldn't identify its exact source. She had perhaps 5 minutes before someone came investigating, maybe 10 if luck favored her for the first time in her entire enslaved existence. Abigail's mind raced through possibilities with the same analytical precision she applied to tobacco processing. She could claim self-defense, but no court in Colorado territory would believe an enslaved woman over a dead white overseer's reputation. She could run immediately, but escaping without supplies or planning meant almost certain death in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. She could hide the body and hope Thompson's disappearance would be attributed to desertion or accident, but the blood spreading across the barn floor made concealment impossible. She chose a fourth option that revealed the tactical intelligence that had kept her alive through 28 years of bondage. She would stage the scene to suggest an accident, giving herself precious hours before the truth emerged, time she could use to prepare an escape that might actually succeed rather than ending in capture and execution. From the Douglas County Sheriff's Log, July 1852, Overseer Thompson found deceased at Willow Creek Plantation under suspicious circumstances. Investigation ongoing. Enslaved workers being questioned. Reward posted for information leading to resolution. Abigail worked in darkness, her hands remembering the barn's layout from thousands of hours spent processing tobacco. She moved Thompson's body slightly, positioning him as though he'd fallen while reaching for supplies on a high shelf. The pistol she placed near his hand, suggesting he'd been carrying it and dropped it during the fall. The blood she couldn't clean became evidence of a tragic accident, a man who'd struck his head on the corner of a workbench while climbing to retrieve equipment. She scattered tools around the scene, creating a narrative of someone who'd been working alone when clumsiness or bad luck transformed routine tasks into fatal misfortune. The performance had to be perfect because Abigail understood something Thompson never had. Enslaved people were always performing, always calculating which mask to wear, which story would keep them breathing another day, which lie might create enough confusion to buy time for truth to become irrelevant. She'd learned these skills from her mother Sarah, who'd taught her that survival in bondage required becoming whoever white people needed you to be in any given moment. Submissive when they wanted obedience, competent when they needed labor, invisible when they sought to forget your humanity. Now Abigail would perform grief and shock while planning an escape that would either deliver her to freedom or death, but never back to the tobacco barn where Thompson's blood was already drying into floorboards that had absorbed too much suffering. 15 minutes after the shooting, Field Supervisor Marcus Davis discovered Thompson's body. Marcus was 45 years old, enslaved since birth, and possessed the particular wariness of someone who'd survived decades by never asking questions that might have dangerous answers. He'd been walking past the tobacco barn when he noticed the door standing open and lamplight extinguished earlier than usual. Thompson's obsessive control meant nothing on the plantation happened outside scheduled routines, so the darkness suggested something wrong. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, his instincts screaming warnings about becoming involved in whatever had occurred in this barn. Then he saw Thompson's body, sprawled at an unnatural angle, and understood that involvement was no longer optional. His shout brought workers running from across the plantation, their faces showing the complex mixture of emotions that Thompson's death inspired. Fear about what his death might mean for them, relief that his particular brand of cruelty had ended, dread about who or what might replace him. Abigail arrived with the others, her face showing exactly the right amount of shock and horror. She pressed her hand to her mouth, gasped Thompson's name, and asked the questions everyone would expect. What happened? How did this occur? Should someone fetch Master Caldwell? The performance was flawless because it wasn't entirely performance. Abigail was genuinely shocked by what she'd done, genuinely horrified by Thompson's death, even though his death had been necessary for her survival. The complexity of her emotions made the deception more believable than pure acting could achieve. Jonathan Caldwell arrived within 20 minutes, his face dark with rage and suspicion. He circled Thompson's body like a predator reading tracks, his boots squelching through blood that had begun to congeal in the summer heat. The enslaved workers gathered in a semicircle, their expressions carefully blank with the particular emptiness they'd perfected for moments when white authorities sought someone to blame. "Accidents don't simply happen to experienced men," Caldwell announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd built a fortune on reading deception in faces that tried to hide everything. "Someone knows what really occurred here, and that someone will tell me before this night ends." The questioning began immediately. Caldwell separated workers, sending some to the main house, others to the equipment sheds, breaking apart any chance they had to coordinate stories or support each other. Isolation was always the first step in extracting truth from people who survived through collective silence. Abigail found herself in Caldwell's office, a space she'd entered countless times to discuss tobacco processing schedules, but which now felt like a courtroom where verdict had already been determined. Virginia Caldwell sat near the window with her needlework, occasionally glancing up to study Abigail's face with the particular suspicion white women reserved for enslaved women they considered potential threats to household order. "You worked in the tobacco barn this afternoon," Caldwell said, his tone deceptively casual as he settled behind his desk. "Tell me what you observed before Thompson's death." Abigail had prepared for this moment during the frantic minutes after the shooting. She let her voice shake slightly, allowed genuine tears to gather not from sadness but from terrifying knowledge that her performance would determine whether her planned escape had any chance of success. "I was checking the curing racks in the secondary barn, Master Caldwell. Mr. Thompson was managing ventilation in the main barn. The humidity was rising, and we were both concerned about potential mold damage to the premium leaves." She paused, letting her breathing become unsteady. "I finished my work and returned to quarters around sunset. I didn't know anything was wrong until Marcus started shouting." The detail about humidity and mold was calculated precision, something verifiable through weather conditions and relevant to plantation operations. The timing placed her away from the scene while establishing legitimate work reasons for being in the barn area earlier. Virginia's needlework paused mid-stitch. "You and Thompson discussed the tobacco processing? Just the two of you, alone in the barns?" The question carried implications that made Abigail's skin crawl. Suggestions that any interaction between her and Thompson must have involved something improper, something that might explain violence or accident through the lens of enslaved women as inherently corrupting influences on white men's behavior. "We discussed it briefly in passing, ma'am," Abigail said carefully. "Mr. Thompson gave instructions about ventilation adjustments. I confirmed understanding and went to handle my assigned tasks in the other barn." Caldwell's fingers drummed against his desk, a rhythmic sound that filled the office with tension. He was calculating, weighing the value of Abigail's skills against the suspicion her proximity to Thompson's death naturally inspired. But Abigail had made one critical error in her performance, something she wouldn't recognize until much later when she was running through mountain wilderness with hunters pursuing her trail. She'd failed to account for the witness she didn't know existed, someone who'd seen enough to make her carefully constructed story collapse like a barn during a Colorado windstorm. Young Benjamin crouched behind the equipment shed, his 12-year-old body trembling with knowledge too heavy for anyone to carry, let alone someone barely entering adolescence. He'd been hiding because he'd violated Caldwell's strict rules about staying away from work areas after dark, drawn by curiosity about the tobacco processing he'd someday be expected to manage. When Thompson cornered Abigail in the barn, Benjamin had frozen behind a stack of crates, too terrified to move, too fascinated by the unfolding confrontation to look away. He'd heard every word of their exchange, witnessed the struggle, seen the pistol discharge, and Thompson fall. Now, 3 hours after intensive questioning had begun, Benjamin sat on the steps of the cabin he shared with his mother Ruth and 5 siblings. The structure was barely weatherproof, constructed from scrap lumber and determination, standing as testament to what enslaved families could create from nothing when survival demanded shelter. Ruth worked in Caldwell's main house as a cook, her culinary skills valuable enough that she'd never been sold despite several offers from neighboring plantations. She possessed rare access to white family conversations, their unguarded moments when they forgot that enslaved people had ears and memories. "They're planning to blame someone," Ruth whispered to Benjamin, her voice barely audible above evening insects. "Master Caldwell's already talking about making examples. Says discipline has grown too loose since Thompson arrived, and perhaps his death proves the need for even stricter control." From Jonathan Caldwell's personal correspondence, July 1852. My dear cousin, a troubling incident has disrupted operations at Willow Creek. Thompson's death under suspicious circumstances demands response that demonstrates continued authority. The enslaved population must understand that challenging white oversight, through violence or deception, will be met with severe consequences regardless of individual value or skills. Benjamin had always been small for his age, which made him nearly invisible to white people but precious to his mother. Ruth had taught him the survival skills every enslaved person learned: when to speak and when to disappear, how to read dangerous moods in white faces, which battles could be fought and which could only be endured. But she'd never prepared him for carrying knowledge that could destroy someone, for understanding that his silence or speech would determine whether Abigail lived or died, whether her remaining family was sold away or kept together. "Mama?" Benjamin whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of what he'd witnessed. "What if I saw something that could answer their questions?" Ruth stopped her pacing. The cabin fell silent, except for distant sounds of the plantation settling into night, sounds that had become background music to their entire enslaved existence. She looked at her son with growing comprehension and dread, understanding that he'd somehow become tangled in whatever had killed Thompson. "What did you see, baby?" Ruth asked, though part of her desperately didn't want to know the answer. Benjamin told her everything. Abigail's confrontation with Thompson, the explicit threats, the struggle for the pistol, the way Abigail had positioned Thompson's body afterward to suggest accident rather than defensive killing. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other, desperate to share the burden of knowledge that had been crushing him since the moment he'd witnessed Thompson fall. Ruth listened with mounting horror, not at Abigail's actions but at the impossible position her son now occupied. If Benjamin stayed silent, the investigation might eventually point elsewhere, landing on whoever Caldwell decided looked most guilty or least valuable. Random accusations and forced confessions would follow, brutal punishments falling on someone who might be completely innocent. But if Benjamin spoke, Abigail would certainly hang, and the message sent to every enslaved person at Willow Creek would be unmistakable. Resistance to white authority, even in self-defense against sexual assault, meant public execution designed to terrorize everyone else into permanent submission. Truth carried a noose in both directions. Ruth understood survival calculations in ways her 12-year-old couldn't fully comprehend. Abigail had killed in legitimate self-defense, protecting herself from assault that everyone on the plantation knew Thompson had been planning for months. But Colorado law recognized no such right for enslaved people. Thompson had been white, male, and empowered by a system that treated his life as infinitely more valuable than any black woman's dignity, safety, or humanity. "Benjamin," Ruth said carefully, choosing words that would shape her son's moral understanding for the rest of his life. "Sometimes seeing things and knowing things are different matters. Sometimes survival means understanding which truths can be spoken and which must be carried silently. You understand what I'm telling you?" But before Benjamin could answer, boots sounded on the cabin steps. Heavy, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority that needed no announcement. Jonathan Caldwell filled the doorway, his presence transforming their small living space into a trap with no exits. Behind him stood Sheriff William Morrison, a weathered man whose reputation for violence extended far beyond Douglas County. He'd built his career on breaking enslaved people's will, understanding that fear was more effective than physical torture, though he wasn't remotely opposed to combining both approaches when necessary. "Ruth," Caldwell said, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant someone was about to suffer regardless of guilt or innocence. "Sheriff Morrison wants to question your boy. Seems young ones sometimes witness things adults miss, and we're very interested in what Benjamin might have seen this evening." Morrison stepped forward, his badge catching lamplight like a warning. He'd spent 15 years extracting confessions from enslaved people, developing techniques that left no physical marks but broke spirits with surgical efficiency. "Son," Morrison said, crouching to Benjamin's eye level with practiced menace, "you've been playing around the work buildings this evening? Sometimes little ones see important things they don't fully understand. Why don't you tell me what you observed near the tobacco barns?" Benjamin felt his mother's hand tighten on his shoulder, a wordless message he struggled to decode. Should he protect Abigail and risk everything his family had built through decades of careful survival? Should he tell complete truth and watch a woman hang for defending herself against assault? Should he claim ignorance and hope Morrison's interrogation skills weren't as refined as his reputation suggested? Ruth made the choice for him, her voice steady despite terror flooding through every nerve. "Benjamin's been with me all evening, Sheriff, helping prepare tomorrow's meals in the main house kitchen. Miss Virginia can confirm his presence there." The lie emerged so smoothly that Benjamin almost believed it himself, spoken with the absolute conviction that came from years of lying to survive, of performing whatever reality white people needed to believe in order to keep families intact and bodies unbroken. But Morrison had questioned enslaved people across 3 territories, and he recognized the particular way mothers lied to protect their offspring. He recognized the way young ones looked when sitting on dangerous secrets, the tension in their small bodies betraying knowledge their mouths refused to share. "Is that accurate?" Morrison stood, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "You were in the main house all evening, Benjamin? Then you must have noticed what Miss Virginia was preparing for tomorrow's dinner service. What dishes was she planning?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, designed to expose the lie through details that couldn't be fabricated on the spot. Benjamin had never been in the main house kitchen that evening. He didn't know what Virginia had been planning, didn't know any specifics that would make his mother's protective deception believable. But 12-year-old Benjamin possessed something neither Morrison nor Caldwell anticipated, the same tactical instinct that had kept Abigail alive through decades of calculated survival. The same ability to perform that had made Ruth valuable enough to keep. The same understanding that enslaved people survived through becoming whoever they needed to be in any dangerous moment. He was about to give an answer that would change everything, setting in motion events that would transform Abigail from suspected killer into the most hunted fugitive in Colorado territory, and would teach Benjamin that sometimes protecting others meant carrying guilt that never fully healed. He would change. Benjamin looked up at Sheriff Morrison with eyes that had learned too much about injustice in 12 short years. He opened his mouth to speak words that would seal Abigail's fate or save her life, words that would define his own moral character in ways a young person shouldn't have to contemplate. What emerged surprised everyone in that cramped cabin, including Benjamin himself. "She was preparing roasted venison with herbs from the garden, Sheriff," Benjamin said, his voice small but carrying the steady confidence of someone reciting absolute truth. "The meat that Master Caldwell brought back from yesterday's hunt. Miss Virginia was concerned it might be tough, so she planned to slow roast it with rosemary and thyme. I was sitting in the corner sorting vegetables, staying quiet so I wouldn't disturb her work." The details flowed with precision that sounded authentic because they were authentic, pulled from Benjamin's memory of previous kitchen sessions he'd actually witnessed, repurposed to create a believable fiction that would protect both Abigail and himself. Each element was perfectly crafted to sound like first-hand observation rather than fabrication. Morrison studied the boy's face with the intense scrutiny of someone who'd built a career on detecting deception. He looked for telltale signs, eyes darting away from direct contact, hands fidgeting with nervous energy, breathing patterns that betrayed stress or fabrication. Benjamin met his gaze without flinching, his small hands folded calmly in his lap, exhibiting composure that came from genuine belief in the story he was telling. The lie had become truth in the telling, because Benjamin understood something profound, that protecting Abigail from execution for defending herself was more morally true than any factual accuracy Morrison might extract through interrogation. Ruth felt her knees weaken with relief and terror combined, understanding that her son had just committed himself to a deception that could cost them everything if discovered, but which represented perhaps the most courageous act of his young life. From Virginia Caldwell's Household Diary, July 1852. The Negro boy Benjamin has always shown unusual intelligence and proper deportment. Ruth has trained him well in household service. He demonstrates none of the insolence that plagues so many younger slaves. His testimony tonight proved most helpful in establishing timelines. Morrison left the cabin convinced of Benjamin's innocence regarding Thompson's death, but more determined than ever to find the truth. If accident theory held, someone needed to be held accountable for the disruption Thompson's death caused. If murder was involved, swift and brutal justice would send necessary messages to enslaved populations across Colorado territory. The investigation expanded through the night. Morrison brought in 2 professional slave hunters from Denver, Men whose reputations for extracting confessions through creative applications of pain preceded them like the smell of burning pitch. Willow Creek Plantation transformed into something resembling military occupation, with armed men questioning workers in shifts, searching cabins, examining every inch of the tobacco barn for evidence that might contradict the accident narrative. Abigail watched these developments from her cabin window, 3 other women sleeping restlessly on corn husk mattresses around her. She'd survived the initial questioning, but Caldwell's determination to find answers meant the investigation would intensify rather than fade. The net was tightening with methodical precision, but Abigail had been planning escape since the moment Thompson's blood first touched tobacco-stained floorboards. She'd spent 5 years at Willow Creek studying the landscape, memorizing patrol patterns after dark, identifying which enslaved people could be trusted with dangerous secrets, and which would betray her for extra food rations or promises of better treatment. She knew the Rocky Mountain wilderness better than most, having been used by Caldwell to gather medicinal plants in similar terrain. The high altitude and unpredictable weather created challenges, but also opportunities for someone desperate enough to embrace nature's dangers over human cruelty. The breakthrough Morrison sought came from an unexpected source that would haunt Abigail for the rest of her life, teaching her that survival sometimes depended on understanding that not everyone could afford the same courage she'd found when Thompson forced her hand. Isaac was a field hand with gambling debts to white men in Denver, obligations he couldn't repay through agricultural labor alone. He'd been watching Abigail carefully since Thompson's death, noticing small changes in her behavior that suggested preparation rather than grief. She checked guard positions with unusual attention. She'd begun rationing her minimal food supplies in ways that suggested planning for travel. She'd quietly asked other women about mountain passes and river crossings, questions framed as casual curiosity, but carrying implications for anyone paying attention. Isaac understood that information could be currency, and he owed dangerous men money that would eventually be collected through violence if he couldn't produce alternative payment. On the 3rd evening after Thompson's death, he approached Morrison with a trade proposal that would save his own life while destroying Abigail's carefully constructed plans. "Sheriff," Isaac said, hat in hand and eyes properly downcast in the performance of submission that white authority demanded, "I've got information you might find valuable, but I'm hoping you might assist me with a small problem I've developed in Denver." Morrison recognized the smell of betrayal wrapped in desperation. He'd encountered it countless times across his career, understanding that enslaved people were as capable of self-interested treachery as anyone else when survival demanded difficult choices. But he also recognized opportunity when presented in such obvious packages. "What kind of information?" Morrison asked, his tone suggesting both interest and contempt for someone willing to betray their own people for personal advantage. "The kind that might explain why Abigail's been acting strange since Thompson died," Isaac replied, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who'd already decided that his survival mattered more than solidarity. "The kind that might interest those slave hunters you brought in from Denver." Within an hour, Morrison had the details. Abigail's midnight walks to the plantation's eastern boundary, ostensibly to check fencing but actually studying escape routes. Her careful questioning of other enslaved people about mountain trails and river crossings. The way she'd been observing guard rotations with tactical precision. Most damning, her request to borrow needle and thread from another woman, supposedly for mending, but Isaac suggested she might be preparing supplies for extended travel. None of it proved murder, but it painted a picture of someone planning to run, and in Morrison's extensive experience, only guilty people ran from investigations. Innocent people might fear unjust punishment, but they didn't prepare elaborate escape plans unless they carried genuine guilt that demanded flight over facing consequences. The trap was set for Saturday night, 3 days after Thompson's death. Morrison positioned his men around the eastern boundary, assuming Abigail would make her break when darkness was deepest, and guards were tired from days of extra vigilance. The slave hunters brought their tracking dogs, bloodhounds trained to follow human scent through water and wilderness, animals worth more than most enslaved people and treated with corresponding care. But Abigail had been watching Isaac as carefully as he'd been watching her. She'd noticed his sudden small privileges, the extra portion of salt pork here, the sip of whiskey there. Tiny rewards that suggested someone was paying for information. She'd survived multiple plantations by understanding that survival meant trusting no one completely, suspecting everyone partially, and always maintaining backup plans for when primary strategies collapsed. Thursday afternoon, while Morrison's men prepared their Saturday ambush, Abigail made a decision that would transform her from suspect into legend, from potential fugitive into actual ghost who would haunt Colorado Territory folklore for generations. Instead of running under cover of darkness as everyone expected, she would escape in broad daylight, using the one advantage no hunter anticipated, appearing to belong exactly where she was until the moment she vanished into wilderness that protected those desperate enough to embrace its dangers. But first she had to survive 2 more nights under the same roof as people who wanted to see her hang, and she had to do it without knowing that Isaac's betrayal had already sealed her fate, that the trap waiting for her on Saturday night would be baited with her own carefully observed patterns and preparations. The bloodhounds would be baying soon enough, their voices cutting through mountain air like promises of death delivered on 4 legs and sustained by the peculiar American institution that treated human beings as property worth less than the dogs used to hunt them. Abigail understood with absolute clarity that her survival now depended on becoming unpredictable, on abandoning every careful plan Isaac had observed and Morrison had prepared to counter. She would have to transform herself from tactical planner into pure improvisation, trusting instinct over strategy, gambling everything on the hope that sometimes desperation creates possibilities that careful preparation never discovers. Friday night brought the kind of crystalline mountain darkness where stars seemed close enough to touch and every sound carried for miles across thin air. Abigail lay awake in the cabin she shared with other women, listening to their breathing, memorizing the rhythm of plantation life she was about to abandon forever. She thought about Benjamin, hoping his lie would protect him when her escape made clear that someone had helped her evade initial suspicion. She thought about Ruth, whose courage in protecting her son had inadvertently protected Abigail as well. She thought about Isaac, understanding without anger that his betrayal came from the same survival instinct that now drove her toward escape. Most of all, she thought about Thompson, about the moment the pistol discharged, and his expression transformed from predatory certainty to shocked incomprehension that an enslaved woman would dare defend herself against his intentions. That moment had changed everything, not just for Abigail, but for every assumption about power and resistance that slavery depended upon. Thompson had died believing that white authority was absolute, that enslaved people existed in a state of permanent submission enforced by law and custom and violence. His death proved that submission was performance, that beneath every mask of obedience lived human beings capable of resistance when survival demanded it, that the entire edifice of slavery rested on lies about human nature that could be shattered by a single act of desperate self-defense. Tomorrow, Abigail would run. Tomorrow, the dogs would follow. Tomorrow, her life would become a chase across wilderness that would test everything she'd learned about survival during 28 years of bondage. But tonight, in the hours before dawn broke across Colorado Territory, Abigail allowed herself to remember that she was human, that she deserved dignity and safety and freedom, that killing Thompson had been justice even if the law would call it murder. She'd already decided that death in the mountains was preferable to hanging in a public square designed to terrorize other enslaved people into permanent submission. She'd already accepted that her escape would likely end in capture or death rather than freedom. But she'd also decided that the attempt mattered more than the outcome, that running toward freedom was its own form of resistance regardless of whether she ever reached safety, that her story would become part of a larger narrative about human beings refusing to accept their own dehumanization even when refusal meant death. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, while Abigail prepared for a journey that would either deliver her to freedom or transform her into a ghost story whispered around Colorado campfires for generations to come. Saturday morning arrived with a kind of deceptive calm that precedes mountain storms, the air so still that birdsong carried across Willow Creek Plantation like warnings whispered between trees. Abigail moved through her usual routines with the practiced normalcy of someone who'd spent a lifetime performing obedience while planning resistance. Breakfast preparation, morning assignments, the 1,000 small tasks that filled an enslaved woman's dawn hours. But beneath the performance of routine, she was executing a plan that would either prove her tactical brilliance or deliver her directly into Morrison's carefully prepared trap. She'd studied guard patterns obsessively since Thompson's death, noting that Morrison's men changed shifts every 6 hours, with a 15-minute overlap for briefings. During that overlap, a narrow window opened in their surveillance. Not long enough for someone to run toward freedom, but sufficient for someone to simply walk away if they appeared to belong wherever they were going. The key was audacity. No one suspected someone would escape in broad daylight, during morning work hours, walking openly across plantation grounds, as though engaged in legitimate tasks. Every fugitive ran under darkness, followed waterways to confuse dogs, sought cover in wilderness before pursuit could organize. Abigail would do the opposite, betting everything on the hope that the most unexpected approach succeeds, precisely because no one believes anyone would be desperate or bold enough to attempt it. From the Denver Daily News, August 1852. Authorities report increased vigilance along mountain passes following recent disturbances at area plantations. Owners advised to maintain careful watch over valuable property during summer work season when escape attempts traditionally increase. At 9 o'clock that morning, Abigail approached the plantation's northern boundary, carrying a large basket of medicinal supplies. She wore work clothing, identical to what she'd worn for 5 years of herb-gathering expeditions that had become so routine they'd faded into the landscape of plantation life, invisible through their very predictability. The guard at the northern checkpoint, a young white man named Peters, barely glanced at her. He'd seen Abigail make this same trek dozens of times over the years, heading into the foothills to gather plants used in plantation medicine. Her herb gathering had Caldwell's explicit permission, documented in plantation records, established as regular duty rather than suspicious activity. "Morning, Peters," Abigail called, her voice carrying the precise mixture of deference and familiarity that white men expected from enslaved women they considered harmless. "Miss Virginia needs fresh willow bark for her headaches. The batch from last week is nearly depleted." Peters nodded absently, his attention focused on the eastern boundary where Morrison expected Abigail to emerge under Saturday night darkness. He never questioned why she needed such a large basket for herb gathering, or why she walked with unusual purpose toward higher elevations than her normal collection areas required, or why something in her posture suggested finality rather than routine. Freedom lived in overlooked details, in the assumptions white people made about enslaved behavior, in the particular blindness that came from viewing human beings as predictable property rather than thinking individuals capable of strategic deception. Abigail led herself deeper into the Rocky Mountain foothills, following trails she'd memorized during months of preparation disguised as medical plant collection. The elevation increased steadily, taking her beyond normal gathering ranges into terrain where few plantation workers ventured and fewer still could navigate safely. 2 miles from the plantation boundary, Abigail reached her first cache, supplies she'd been smuggling out during previous expeditions and hiding in locations marked by subtle arrangements of stones that appeared natural to casual observers but carried specific meaning to someone who'd placed them deliberately. Dried food wrapped in oiled cloth, a sturdy knife, flint for fire starting, a wool blanket despite summer heat because mountain nights could kill through cold even in August. Most importantly, men's clothing in approximately her size, garments that would help her blend into populations of free black laborers and miners who traveled Colorado territory seeking work. She'd planned for everything except the variable that would nearly destroy her careful preparations before the escape truly began. While Abigail changed into men's clothing behind a stand of pine trees, Isaac was leading Sheriff Morrison and his slave hunters directly to her normal herb-gathering locations, providing detailed maps of her usual routes and collection areas. "She always starts at Willow Creek's northern branch," Isaac explained, his voice carrying eager cooperation of someone desperate to collect promised rewards. "Then she works her way west toward the higher elevations where the best medicinal plants grow. If she's planning to run, that's the direction she'll go." Morrison studied the terrain with professional assessment honed through years of hunting fugitives across difficult country. The mountain wilderness offered excellent cover but limited escape routes. Water channels and game trails funneled movement into predictable patterns. Even someone familiar with the landscape would struggle to move quickly through terrain that punished every wrong step with twisted ankles, cliff faces, or encounters with predators. "We'll surround her usual gathering areas," Morrison decided, deploying his men with tactical precision. "Drive her toward the river crossing, where the dogs can corner her against water too deep and fast for safe passage. She can't have gotten far, and mountain wilderness will do half our work." But Morrison had made the same mistake as everyone else throughout Abigail's life. He'd underestimated her willingness to abandon comfortable plans for pure survival instinct, her capacity to become unpredictable when predictability meant death. While his men deployed around her usual gathering spots, Abigail was already 5 miles away, following game trails most people didn't know existed, moving through terrain that offered neither comfort nor safety, but which protected those desperate enough to embrace nature's indifference over human cruelty. She'd covered nearly 8 miles before the first hounds began baying behind her, their voices carrying across mountain air like promises that pursuit had finally realized she'd escaped. The sounds spurred Abigail to push deeper into wilderness that would test every survival skill she'd developed during 28 years of bondage. The chase had begun in earnest, but they were chasing someone who'd already vanished into a landscape that rewarded desperation over strategy, instinct over planning, and the kind of determination that came from understanding that death in the mountains was preferable to hanging in a public square designed to terrorize other enslaved people into permanent submission. The San Miguel Mountains stretched endlessly before Abigail, peaks rising like jagged teeth against Colorado sky, while pine forests thick enough to swallow sound covered the lower elevations. She'd been running for 12 hours straight, following deer trails and creek beds that led steadily upward into terrain where thin air made every breath a conscious effort. Behind her, perhaps 3 miles back, but closing steadily, the bloodhounds' voices created a chorus of promised death. Morrison's hunting party had finally discovered her deception, realizing that Abigail had abandoned her usual routes for wilderness that most people avoided even in summer when conditions were least hostile. The professional slave hunters from Denver had adapted to mountain conditions faster than Abigail hoped, learning to read sign even in difficult terrain, understanding how to work with their dogs in high altitude, coordinating their pursuit with methodical efficiency that left little room for error or lucky escape. Abigail found temporary shelter behind a granite outcropping, allowing herself 5 minutes of rest while her lungs struggled to process air that seemed too thin to sustain life. Her men's clothing was soaked with sweat despite mountain cold, her hands bleeding from scrambling over rocks, her feet developing blisters that would make continued running increasingly agonizing. She pulled dried meat from her supply bundle, forcing herself to eat despite exhaustion that made swallowing difficult. Food meant energy. Energy meant distance. Distance meant the difference between freedom and capture, between life as a fugitive or death as an example. From Sheriff Morrison's official report, August 1852, pursuit of fugitive Abigail Anderson complicated by terrain and weather conditions. Subject demonstrated unexpected knowledge of mountain wilderness, leading hunters through areas requiring specialized tracking skills. Dogs maintained scent trail despite elevation and water crossings. The mountains were testing Abigail in ways that made plantation labor seem almost gentle by comparison. Every step forward demanded calculating risks that could kill as surely as Morrison's rifles. Loose rocks that might trigger, falls down cliff faces. Creek crossings, where one misstep meant drowning in water too cold and fast for survival. Mountain lions and bears that viewed human beings as potential prey rather than apex predators. But Abigail had advantages Morrison couldn't quantify, resources that came from 28 years of surviving impossible circumstances. She understood desperation in ways that free men never would, knew how to find strength when rational people would surrender, possessed the particular clarity that came from having already decided that death was acceptable but submission was not. She also knew these mountains better than Morrison realized. Her 5 years of herb gathering had taught her which plants indicated water sources, which animal trails led to passes rather than dead ends, which rock formations provided shelter from weather that could turn lethal within minutes. As sunset approached, Abigail faced her most dangerous gamble. The safe route would keep her in lower elevations where travel was easier and exposure less threatening. The risky route would take her over a high mountain pass where August nights could bring freezing temperatures and afternoon storms arrived with little warning, but which would also force her pursuers to either follow through equally dangerous terrain or abandon pursuit until conditions improved. With the hounds, voices growing steadily closer and her body approaching the limits of endurance, Abigail chose the high pass, betting everything on the hope that Morrison's men would value their own lives more than capturing one escaped woman, that professional hunters wouldn't risk death in mountain wilderness for the reward money her capture would bring. The gamble nearly killed her before pursuit even became relevant. The pass required climbing nearly vertical rock faces, using handholds that crumbled under her weight, crossing snowfields in August, where one slip meant sliding into crevasses that would hold her body until spring thaw. The air grew so thin that Abigail's vision began to blur, her thoughts becoming sluggish and confused in ways that made navigation increasingly difficult. She reached the pass summit just as the sun disappeared behind western peaks, plunging the mountains into darkness so complete that stars provided the only light. Temperature dropped 30 degrees within an hour, transforming her sweat-soaked clothing into ice that threatened hypothermia despite the wool blanket she wrapped around her shoulders. Below, perhaps 2 miles distant, she could see torches marking Morrison's position. The hunting party had stopped for the night, rather than attempting the pass in darkness, choosing survival over immediate pursuit, giving Abigail precious hours to increase her lead before morning light allowed them to follow. But those hours came at terrible cost. Abigail spent the night huddled behind rocks that provided minimal shelter from wind that cut through clothing like knives made of frozen air. She couldn't risk fire, knowing that flames would mark her position for miles. She could only endure, fighting to stay conscious while her body tried to shut down in response to cold and exhaustion that would kill her if she allowed herself to sleep. Dawn brought relief from darkness but revealed new horrors. During the night, clouds had gathered around the peaks, bringing the kind of afternoon thunderstorm that made Colorado mountains legendary for killing unprepared travelers. Abigail had perhaps 4 hours before weather transformed her escape route into a death trap of lightning, flooding creeks, and reduced visibility. She forced herself to move, descending the pass's western slope toward terrain that might offer food and shelter if she survived long enough to reach it. Every step became an exercise in willpower over physical limits, her body demanding rest that circumstances couldn't permit. The breakthrough she desperately needed came from an unexpected direction. Halfway down the western slope, Abigail discovered evidence that she wasn't the first fugitive to choose this particular route toward freedom. Carved into a sheltered rock face, barely visible unless you knew to look, were initials and dates marking previous escapes. M.W., June 1849, Freedom or Death. J.T., August 1850, followed the North Star. L.K., May 1851. They cannot chain what they cannot catch. Most significantly, behind a carefully arranged pile of stones, Abigail found a hidden cache containing dried food, a water skin, and a hand-drawn map showing routes through the mountains toward settlements where free black communities offered sanctuary to fugitives. Someone had been maintaining this underground refuge, helping people like her navigate toward freedom. The discovery transformed everything, providing not just supplies but hope that survival was possible, that others had succeeded where she now struggled. The map revealed something that changed her entire strategy. The route she'd planned would have taken her directly through a valley, where Morrison's contacts among white settlers would report any suspicious travelers. The alternative marked on this map led through more difficult terrain, but toward a crossing where underground railroad conductors waited to ferry fugitives toward Kansas territory and eventual freedom. Thunder rumbled across the peaks as Abigail studied the map, memorizing routes before weather made travel impossible. Behind her, perhaps a mile distant now, she could hear the hounds beginning their morning pursuit, their voices carrying clearly through thin mountain air. She had to choose: seek shelter from the approaching storm and lose precious distance, or push forward through weather that could kill her through lightning or hypothermia, but which might also force Morrison's men to halt their pursuit until conditions improved. Abigail chose forward motion, gambling that desperation and determination could overcome the same weather that might stop professional hunters who had warm camps and comfortable lives to return to after unsuccessful pursuits. The storm hit with a sudden violence characteristic of Rocky Mountain weather, transforming afternoon into twilight as clouds swallowed the sun. Rain fell in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible, turning trails into streams and loose rocks into landslide hazards. Lightning struck close enough that Abigail could smell ozone and feel static electricity raising hair on her arms. But the storm also masked her trail, washing away scent that dogs needed to follow, creating noise that covered sounds of her passage through terrain that would normally betray movement to experienced hunters. When the storm finally passed 3 hours later, Abigail had gained crucial distance. Morrison's party had been forced to shelter in place while she pushed forward, accepting risks that rational people avoided, choosing possible death from lightning over certain death from capture. Abigail stood at the edge of the Arkansas River as dawn broke across the water, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold, while the sound of approaching horses thundered through the morning mist. 4 days of desperate flight had brought her to this final moment, this impossible choice between freedom across 150 yards of churning water and the hunters closing the distance behind her. The crossing marked on her stolen map should have had Underground Railroad conductors waiting with a boat, but Abigail found only empty shoreline and muddy banks showing no recent signs of human activity. Either she'd arrived on the wrong day, or the network had been compromised, or the map's information was outdated by months of changing circumstances. Behind her, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, Morrison's voice called her name through the trees. The professional slave hunters had finally closed the gap, their dogs barking with excitement of a successful hunt nearly complete. 4 days of pursuit through mountain wilderness had brought them to this moment where Abigail's choices narrowed to immediate surrender or desperate gamble. The river ran high with mountain snowmelt, its current strong enough to drown even experienced swimmers. But across that water lay Kansas territory, where different laws applied and Morrison's authority ended at the state boundary. If Abigail could reach the far shore alive, she'd have at least temporary protection from immediate capture. She waded into the Arkansas, feeling the current strength trying to sweep her downstream. The water rose quickly to her waist, then her chest, numbing cold making her movements clumsy. Every step forward required fighting against forces of nature that cared nothing for her desperate need for freedom. Morrison reached the riverbank as Abigail struggled toward midstream. He raised his rifle, the distance perhaps 60 yards, an easy shot for an experienced marksman. But he hesitated, understanding that killing a fleeing woman would raise questions he preferred to avoid, especially with witnesses who might testify at subsequent legal proceedings. "Stop right there, Abigail," Morrison shouted. "There's nowhere left to run. Surrender now, and I'll see you get fair treatment." The lie was transparent to everyone present. Fair treatment for an enslaved woman who'd killed a white overseer meant public hanging, designed to terrorize other enslaved people into permanent submission. Morrison knew this as clearly as Abigail did, but the performance of mercy served his reputation. Abigail kept moving forward, each step carrying her deeper into water that might drown her but which also carried her closer to the far shore, where freedom waited like a promise that might cost everything to claim. What happened next depends on who tells the story and why they're telling it. Some accounts claim Abigail reached Kansas soil where conductors appeared from hiding to spirit her toward Canada, and the kind of freedom that slavery couldn't touch. Others insist the current swept her away, taking her body to the river bottom where the Arkansas keeps its darkest secrets. Morrison's official report listed the outcome as uncertain due to weather and water conditions, a bureaucratic evasion that satisfied no one but protected his reputation from questions about why an experienced hunter failed to capture one exhausted woman. But travelers along the Arkansas River still whisper about a woman who appears on foggy mornings helping other fugitives cross toward freedom, her determination stronger than the current, her spirit impossible to chain even in death. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.